Last week, I showed you how you can get an extra level of security working in Lightroom by utilizing XMP files. And that's where you could take the information that's usually stored just in your Lightroom catalog file and also stored in the folders that contain your images. And therefore, if your Lightroom catalog file ever failed, got deleted, or Lightroom just stopped working, you could still get to your images and all the adjustments you've applied. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and take a look at a little bit more of the intricacies that are involved with working with XMP files. Here goes. First, a quick review. XMP stands for Extendable Markup Platform. And here's what's included inside of an XMP file. I'll show you how to create them in a moment, but when you're in Lightroom and you save an XMP file, it has all your develop settings that you've applied to your images in the develop module. It has star ratings, it has color labels, it has anything you've done in the metadata panel, like if you added a caption to your image. And also any keywords that you've applied. All that stuff gets saved in the same folder as your original image. But here's what's not included in those XMP files. And that would be if you ever made a virtual copy in Lightroom, if you ever stacked more than one image on top of each other, or if you've put things into a collection. All those images will still be there, but it won't remember that one of them had a virtual copy or was included in a stack or a collection. Also, it won't remember your sort orders, and therefore if you set up complex slideshows with just the right order, you're going to lose that. But if you look at what's on the left side of the screen, it's most of the critical stuff. Now, XMP files are for raw files. If, on the other hand, you have a TIFF file, a JPEG file, a Photoshop file, a DNG file, it can save the same information directly in the file itself so you don't end up with an extra file called an XMP. We still call it metadata. We might still refer to it as XMP information, but it can be included in the file itself. Now, metadata, which is what collectively all this stuff is known as, can be read by Lightroom when you're importing pictures. Let's say you started a brand new Lightroom catalog and decided to start over and import your images again. Well, it can read that. It can also be read by Photoshop or Adobe Camera Raw. And therefore, if you open one of your images using any of those three, you'd still have your adjustments. So let's cover it again. Is how do we back up the information that's usually in our Lightroom catalog file to an XMP sidecar file, if it's a raw file, or directly into the image? We have quite a few options. First, if you're in the library module, go to the metadata menu. That's where you're going to find a choice of Save Metadata to File. If you're in the develop module processing a picture, then the same choice will be found under the photo menu. Or I don't usually go to the menus. You can also right-click on an image. That's control-clicking if you're on a Mac with one mouse button, and you're going to find also a choice there. But I usually just type Command-S on a Mac, Control-S in Windows. That's a keyboard shortcut for doing the same thing. Or if you know you're committed to this, then why not just go to your catalog settings, and under the metadata tab, there's just a checkbox to have this happen automatically. And therefore, the moment you're done processing an image and you head back to the library module, it would automatically save this info into an XMP file. Now, there's all sorts of other stuff related to this. So let's switch over to Lightroom and take a look at what else we need to know about when it comes to metadata and XMP files. The first thing you should do, if you've committed to using XMP files as a backup, is to go to the View menu. And that's where you're going to find a choice called View Options. If I choose that, we got a lot of choices that are in here, but one of them under Cell Icons is called Unsaved Metadata. Now, if I move this out of the way so you actually look at the pictures that are here, you'll find some of the images in the upper right have an icon that relates to metadata. That's what all these have to do with. But there are some others that don't, and only if I turn on this checkbox am I going to see all of the icons that relate to metadata. So if you're going to use metadata as a backup of your catalog info, you probably want to have that turned on. Remember, I got to that by going up here when I'm in the library to the View menu, and I chose View Options, and this choice was called Unsaved Metadata. Now let's take a look at those icons that are found in the upper right of many of the thumbnails that you have when you work in Lightroom. Most of the time you're going to run into one of three icons, either one that points with an arrow down, one that points with an arrow up, or one that has an exclamation point. But as long as it's got 3 horizontal lines to the left of it, then it has to do with metadata. So let's think about what those mean. Well, remember, metadata is like your develop settings you've done in the develop module. And what we're doing by typing Command S or just in some way telling it to save that into the same folder as our files is we have a backup to what's in our Lightroom catalog file. Well, now what happens if we make a change to the image in Lightroom? Well, if we make a change in Lightroom, then there is going to be an icon on your image with a down pointing arrow to indicate that the changes you've just made in your develop module, let's say you move the exposure slider, they're not reflected in the XMP file that already exists for that particular image. That's because either you don't have the preference turned on to automatically save it there, or you just haven't typed Command S yet to tell it to save it. So a down pointing arrow indicates what's in your Lightroom catalog file is newer than what's in the XMP file. They don't match, and you just need to type Command S, or you could just click on that down pointing arrow to say, hey, let's update it. And when you do, let's come over here and do it. Here's one with the down pointing arrow, meaning what's in my Lightroom catalog file is newer than what's in the XMP file for this image. So I'm just going to hit the down pointing arrow, and here it says, hey, do you want to update the metadata for this photo? Because it's been changed in Lightroom. Do you want to save the changes to disk? Now, I would choose don't show again, because I'm going to be clicking that icon all the time to say, hey, update it if it's not already, and just hit save. Now, the next time you find a down pointing arrow, all you got to do is click on it. It will update the XMP file associated with that image or the internal metadata, and the icon will go away. Then, on the other hand, if you find an up pointing arrow, that means that this image has an XMP file that has a modification date newer than the last time you worked on this image within Lightroom. That would usually be if you've adjusted this image using Adobe Camera Raw instead of Lightroom, or more commonly used a plugin. Like you have Nik Silver Effects Pro or some other plugin where you take an image from Lightroom, you send it to that plugin, and when it's done, it sends you back to Lightroom. Well, that plugin did something to modify and update that file, and Lightroom's just looking at it and saying, hey, that's newer than what I have in my Lightroom database file. And so what do you want me to do with it? So if you purposefully made a change that Lightroom would understand, then you could click that icon and it's going to get rid of any adjustments that were done right here in Lightroom and will load in instead what's in the XMP file. Now, it would be rare for me to do that unless I just now purposefully made a change to this file in another piece of software and I want Lightroom to update to show it. Then I could click that icon. Now, when I click the icon, though, it's going to ask me a question. It's going to say, hey, what would you like to do? And what it's asking here, should Lightroom import the settings from disk or overwrite the settings that are on that disk with what's in your Lightroom catalog file? And you have the choice, import what's on the disk, which means what another program did to that file, or overwrite it, to update it, just like typing Command S. And most of the time, I'm choosing overwrite, because the only time I would choose import settings from disk is when I know I made a change specifically to this file that I need Lightroom to know about. And most of the time, I think of Lightroom as being the one and only truth about my images. And so I would come in here and choose overwrite. Or if you're not sure what to do right now, click cancel. Then the other icon you can get looks like an exclamation point. It's this. And that means you've made a change to this both in Lightroom and something else has made a change to the XMP file. And it wants to know what to do. Now, if you hover over this, you usually get a little thing that says metadata in conflict. And if you click on it, this will come up. And it just says, hey, this has been changed both in Lightroom and by another program. And so what should you do? The 99.9% of the time, I choose override settings because I think of what's in my Lightroom catalog file as being the one and only truth. And if I had made a change in an external program and I was one that Lightroom can understand and I really wanted it to happen here, I would have right away after doing that, I would have chosen import settings from disk. But since I'm just navigating this folder at a random time, I think of what's in my Lightroom catalog always as being the one and only truth for this image, and so I would choose overwrite settings. Or just to keep the icon the same in case we want to deal with it later, I click cancel right there. Then you're going to find that sometimes this looks a little different. Notice that this icon and the one to the right of it are inside of a rectangular box. But the image on the right, it's not inside of a rectangular box, but otherwise it looks the same. So why would they do that? Well, if you were to click on that image, if you really want to know what's going on, you should hover over that. You should get a little thing. It says error, writing metadata. And what that means is at some point, Lightroom, either through automation with that preference setting you could turn on to tell it to automatically write changes to metadata, or me typing Command S to do it manually, I've done that and I've told it to make the changes to that file, but it couldn't. Most of the time that happens because right after you type Command S, let's say you did that for 1,000 files. Well, it can't instantaneously update all those files. It will take it a few minutes. What if you put your computer to sleep? Or you disconnected the hard drive that has the original pictures on it? Then it would have been trying to save things into those XMP files, but it couldn't, and therefore it would prompt an error. This is the error. That's when you see it without a rectangle around it. It means it had difficulty writing to the metadata. And so all you need to do is click on that image and type Command S, or if you click the icon, let me show you. If I click the icon, it's just going to tell you there was an unknown error. When you're trying to write the metadata, just retry. That's all you got to do. When you choose retry, it will attempt to do it. And in this case, I find out why it couldn't do it, because it can't find that file. If that folder is simply not on my hard drive, and the hard drive that contains it is not attached to my computer, it can't save it. So you might get this. So that's the difference between having a rectangle around it, that's when it can resolve things, and when it doesn't have a rectangle, that's when it can't resolve it, or it just had an issue when it was attempting to write the metadata. So let's say you have a large number of images and you want to find out those statuses. Well, you can come up here to what's known as the filter bar when you're in the library module of Lightroom. If you don't find this filter bar, you can go to the view menu, and right there is a choice of show filter bar. And you can hit the backslash key to show and hide it as well, which I can do with my keyboard right now. But you'll see that one of the choices up here in the filter bar is metadata. But there are all sorts of different kinds of metadata, and for the kind we're talking about, the kind that have to do with XMP files and develop settings, what you need to do is click on the far left column right at the top, and here you can choose what that particular column is going to display. We want it to display the metadata status. And if we do, now we can see here we have 5 images where the metadata, meaning the developed settings and other things for this image, have been changed on your hard drive, but not within your Lightroom catalog file. So these images we either modified using a plugin or using Adobe Camera Raw or something else updated their information. And if I had just did that, I could right now click this little up arrow key here to say, let's have those changes reflected here in Lightroom. Or more commonly, I would just select all and type Command S, because what's in my Lightroom catalog file, I think of as being the one and only truth for all my images. And if I wasn't expecting these to be changed on disk, I would assume what's in my Lightroom catalog file would be more appropriate. Then there's a choice of has been changed. Has been changed is where you've made a change in the develop module or in the metadata panel in Lightroom, but that change has not been saved to the file itself or to an XMP file. And that's when you find that little down pointing arrow. You could either click the down and pointing arrow, or with that image selected, type Command S to save it back in there, and then this would no longer be set to has been changed, because the XMP file would reflect the same information that's in your Lightroom catalog file. Then here we have another choice called conflict detected. And that could be where, let's say you imported this picture, then you went to the develop module and you moved the sliders around to process the image, but you didn't have Lightroom set up to save those changes into the XMP file. Then you took the exact same image and you opened it in Adobe Bridge, you adjusted it with Camera Raw, and those changes were stored in an XMP file. That means what's in Lightroom's catalog file doesn't match what's in the XMP file. It's been changed in both places. And that's where there's a conflict. And if you see this little exclamation point and you click on it, it would tell you that it's been changed both by Lightroom and another program. Now, I think of Lightroom as the only truth for my images, so I would simply choose Overwrite Settings. The only reason I'm going to click Cancel is so we still have some images in this state. All right, so we've looked at Changed on Disk. That's when we're going to have the up pointing arrow. We have Has Been Changed. That's when you made a change in Lightroom and it's not reflected in your XMP file. That's the down pointing arrow. And then we have Conflict Detected. And that's where it's most likely been changed in more than one place. But what's in your Lightroom catalog file is usually the only truth, so you just choose Save for these to update the metadata. But then there's another choice here called Unknown. And those are the ones where you have that exclamation point and it won't have the box around it. Most of the time, that means there was a problem at the time it tried to save metadata for these files, and it didn't have access to the original files. You disconnected your hard drive, or you put your computer to sleep before it could finish, and so it's just giving you that. And again, you can click on these and type Command-S to have it save it into the XMP metadata. And then finally, we have one that's called Up to Date. And that's where what's in the XMP file matches what's in your Lightroom catalog file, so they're both in agreement, and that's where we'd like to be in the end. So let's stop filtering our images. I'll choose None up here. And let's see how this might work if you happen to work both in Lightroom and in other programs like Adobe Camera Raw. Here I have an image I want to work with. But I want to work with not just this image, but all the other images that would be in the same folder as this one. So I'm going to right-click on the image and choose Go to Folder in Library so I can see where it's stored on my hard drive. And I can see it's down here. It's some iPhone shots. And in here, I have a whole folder full of images. Well, let's say I want to work with those images outside of Lightroom. I could click on any one of these images, right-click, and there's a choice called Show in Finder. Then, when I'm in the Finder, I'd see all these pictures. And I can grab any one of those pictures, and if I happen to have Bridge running, I could drag one of the images to Bridge. And here I am, looking at the exact same folder of images. But notice the images look different here. Most of them are black and white. And that's because I did that earlier today. And earlier today, I typed Command-A for Select All. And then I went up here and I said Open in Camera Raw. And when I opened this in Camera Raw, all I did was I typed Command-A, so I'd have all the images selected once again. And then up here, I chose black and white to convert all the images to black and white. But I'm using Camera Raw to do this, not Lightroom. And Camera Raw, when you make any changes to any of these sliders, and then you click Done, it saves us things as XMP files. If it's a RAW file. If it's a JPEG file or another file format that could have it stored directly inside, it stores it directly in the image. But if I go to this same folder of images and I view it in Lightroom, Lightroom doesn't know that I made those changes. Well, it actually does. If you look at any one of these images and you hover over it, you're going to find that the vast majority of them have an up pointing arrow. And that means the XMP file's been changed by another program. It got turned to black and white. Not reflected here though. So I'm going to click the up pointing arrow on one of these images. When I do, it asks this question. And I'm going to tell it to import the settings from the disk. That means import the settings that Adobe Camera Raw attached to the image. So when I choose import settings from disk, I should end up with a black and white picture. If, on the other hand, I go to a different picture like this one that has the same up pointing arrow key, and I click on it, and this time I say, no, let's not import the settings from the disk. Instead, let's overwrite those settings that are on our hard drive. That means the settings in an XMP file or directly in the JPEG. Let's overwrite them with what's in our Lightroom catalog file. So I choose that. The image will not change in appearance, but it'll no longer have that arrow. And if I were to take that exact same image and I choose Show in Finder, and I try to view that image again in Adobe Bridge, Well, Bridge should see the change that was saved from Lightroom. It's right over here on the right side, and you see its full color again. So we can tell it which version should be stored with the file itself. Let's head back over to Lightroom. So if I did not make any changes purposefully in Adobe Camera Raw, and I want here in Lightroom, I want it to completely ignore that. I just leave the images as they are because it defaults to using what's in the Lightroom catalog file. But if I want that extra level of backup to make sure that if I back up these images, that I also have the adjustments backed up, then I'm going to type Command A to select all, and I'm going to type Command S. Command S means save things to metadata, and up here it says saving to metadata. Once this progress bar finishes, I could return to Adobe Bridge and everything would look just like it did here in Lightroom. Now, on occasion, you're going to get this warning. And that's because there are certain file formats that it can't save this stuff into. Lightroom can't adjust movie files. These are all .mov files. And if you were to actually scroll through, you would have found that none of those turn black and white anyway. So those are just file formats not compatible with this. Then the only image this is messed up is this one, which is the one where I click the up pointing arrow to say import the settings from the disk, from the XMP file. So for that one, I'm going to head to the develop module. And on the left side of my screen, it'll say I imported the picture, and then in the history, it says I imported from metadata. If I didn't want that, I just click on the step before it, and I'm back to what we had earlier. But let's say for some reason, I actually needed to go to Bridge here, and I needed to take specifically these, what is this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 images. And I needed to be able to come in here and adjust them with Camera Raw for some reason. For maybe Lightroom just wouldn't launch or something. And I needed to make them black and white. I click Done. And now what I'd like is to be able to head back into Lightroom and have Lightroom figure out which of those images have changed. I don't want to look at all those little icons to see if anything has changed. This is where if I purposefully made a change outside of Lightroom and I want Lightroom to recognize it, what I do is I go here to my folder list. I right click on the folder and I choose Synchronize. Synchronize means compare what's on the disk where the original images are contained to what's in your Lightroom catalog file. And one of your choices is to scan for metadata updates. If I have that turned on, it's going to be looking for changes in the XMP files or the metadata attached to the images. And when I choose Synchronize, it's going to load those in and change the way the image looks. So now I just have to scroll down and find those images, but might take it a moment here to update. But eventually these images, if I were to head to the develop module or do something else that causes it to actually think about them, they're eventually going to update to show their black and white status. Sometimes it's slow though, and it can take a while for it to update. I had to wait just now 3 or 4 minutes before all those images updated to reflect the changes that I had made in Adobe Camera Raw. But it was able to read them in and reflected here in Lightroom. That would be a rare instance because most of the time I adjust images starting in Lightroom and I don't do them in Adobe Camera Raw. Now, just last week, this concept of working with XMP files and metadata really saved me. Let me give you an instance of when it was. I was working with a folder full of about 100 images. And I didn't realize before going to the develop module that somehow all the images in the folder were all selected. And when I went to the develop module and I started moving the adjustment sliders around, it wasn't adjusting just one image. It was adjusting about 100. I was in the masking feature that is in the newer version of Lightroom, and I spent about 30 minutes masking various parts of the image and doing very precise adjustments. And right when I was near done and I started paying attention to the bottom edge of my screen is when I noticed that I moved a slider and a little bar showed up saying updating 143 images or something similar to that. And that's when I realized that I was making those changes to all the images in a folder. And I was like, I can't get all those images to have those changes. It's going to completely mess up what I have. So here's what I did. I clicked on a single image, the one image I actually was attempting to change in the library module. and I typed Command S. Command S meant save the changes I had done in the develop module, save it in an XMP file. Then I right-clicked on the image and I said show in Finder, which means show me in my operating system. And I could see there was the original RAW file, and right next to it was an XMP file with the same file name. Well, I just took that XMP file and I copied it to my desktop. So it wasn't no longer in the same folder as those other images. Then back in Lightroom, I just typed Command Z. Command Z, that's the shortcut for undo. And I had to type it about 50 times to get back to what it was like before I started working on that image. And therefore I was able to get all 140 images back to what they looked like before I messed up and started adjusting a large number of images. Finally, once I got to that point, I went to my operating system. I grabbed the XMP file that I'd copied to my desktop and I dragged it back to the folder where the image was. Then, over in Lightroom, I looked at the image and I saw an up pointing arrow where Lightroom was saying, wait a minute, what you have on your drive is newer than what I have in the Lightroom catalog file. I clicked on that up pointing arrow and I said import settings from disk. And it imported all those settings, it applied all to the image, and I had all the complex masking that I had done, but only to the one image. And all the other ones I was able to get back to the way they used to be. So there's more than one advantage to using metadata and XMP files, but the main thing is it makes me feel much more comfortable working in Lightroom by not trusting all my changes to a single little catalog file. Instead, I get an extra level of backup where all those adjustment changes I've made, all my ratings and my color labels and my keywords, they're attached either to the image itself or to a little file right next to it known as a sidecar file that ends with the letters XMP. And that means that if Lightroom ever completely stops working, I can still open that image. In Photoshop or Camera Raw, it'll still have all the adjustments I've applied. Or I could start from scratch in Lightroom. If my Lightroom catalog file got deleted, I could just make a brand new one and re-import all my images. And as it was importing them, it would have found all those adjustment settings in either XMP files or directly in the image itself if it could save it there. And I would still have all my work. By doing so, I feel so much more confident working in Lightroom and trusting that catalog file with that little extra level of backup. I'm Ben Wilmore. I'll see you next time.